Yeah. So
is that okay? Well, but you can start the introduction, say welcome, and then
if you want to sit there, Mark, I can pan.
Just pan. Okay,
let's do that.
We can do that. Get ready.
I'll just leave that there. On that.
Yep.
I'll just leave that. So.
Oh, you do the introduction.
I can do the introduction. Okay. We'll see. Oh God. What happened to my hair? Did the same thing?
See, it's the same thing. I'm telling you.
Yeah,
Did it to me too. What are you?
It's that camera. It's all camera. It's hair removing.
Can you come forward just a little bit?
I'm a bit.
That will mean that then all
Then
I
you don't have to focus.
Pan across here.
Because he looks about 6 times the size of me, which
I have 6 times. Yeah.
There you go. That's probably a bit more. I can't. If I sit like that,
yeah.
I just look at it, and I just look at it. Ah, it'll be right. Should be right. Okay. So as long as I sit forward,
And I'll sit back a bit.
Well, you're going to have to be doing the whole thing, so just comfortable. Whatever's comfortable with you. You wearing your trousers off. Morning, everybody. Mark Gishin here from SA Wine Industry Association. Welcome to the webinar. We're just waiting for a couple more attendees to log in. We'll just give it a very short period of time. If you can just bear with us and hang in there, we'll give them about a minute or so, and otherwise we'll be straight into it. So I'll just mute myself again. Just hang in there. We'll be back in a second. Okay, I can see a couple of attendees there. Welcome, Fabiano. Welcome, Trevor. Just wondering, Trevor, if the sound is coming through okay, could you just send us a chat message in the Q&A? There should be a panel on your screen, just to let us know that you can hear okay. If you write something in there, would be greatly appreciated. And Fabiano as well, if you could just mention that.
There we go.
It looks like we're on chat.
Good day. Thanks, Trev. Thanks, Fabio.
Thank you. Excellent. All right. I think we'll make a start. I'm sure there'll be others joining us shortly. Let's move that screen. That's fine. We're bringing this webinar hosted by ASVO, and we thank ASVO for joining with us to do this. This is a program that we're running at the moment, is a partnership that is funded by Green Industries SA. Sawyer is running it, the South Australian Wine Industry Association, and 2XE are our partners in delivering the program. And you'll be hearing mostly from, well, almost entirely from them. We have two of their experts that will be with us today. This program, so just a little bit about Sawyer. We're a membership-based organisation, and we represent most of the interests, and we cover a wide range of topics, including industrial relations, work health, safety and environment. And this program falls under the environment. Green Industries SA is the organisation funding this program, and there's their slide up there. They also run a REAP program where you can go directly to get some assistance, but through this program they are also providing some funding for a program that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, expressions of interest for getting an on-site review. So this program itself is a two-stage program. 2XE have conducted some research into demand management, and they are presenting that information in this round of seminars. What will then happen is we have a small amount of money to select on a range of criteria, a number of sites where 2XE will come on site and do a full assessment for your energy demand management opportunities and help you develop a business case. That'll be funded to the tune of 75%, and it's worth, the total was worth about $6,000. So every company that's selected needs to be able to contribute $1,500, and then the rest will come in. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's what that feedback sheet that I sent out this morning is all about. Not so much about, ignore the stuff on catering and all of that, but the most important thing is if you want to be in the program, we need to have that back with your expression of interest. We'll be assessing them collectively in very shortly, probably during next week. So we'll be looking to make a start quickly. So I will now basically hand over to 2XE to run you through it all. I'll just say that you can, if you have a question at any time, send it in through the chat box. There's a little Q&A box, so you can send through the question. We'll pick it up. Chris Waters from ASVO is our technical operator here, and he'll be picking up on those questions. And we'll endeavour to answer those as we go. But feel free to put those questions forward to James and Luke, who you'll meet later on, as we go. So meanwhile, I'll just hand straight over to James to take over.
Cool. Hey guys, so Trevor I know quite well. Fabiano and Grant, it's great that you could all be here today. Hopefully for anyone who's recording this as well, that would who are watching this later, that'd be fantastic. So I think for the most part of it, just talking about the expression of interest that Mark was discussing earlier, everything that we go through today in this seminar, this is the sort of work that we'll be going through with any of the sites who choose to take on our services through this Green Industries program. So yeah, please make use of it. It's a decent fund from the government, and it's a good investment. So we will hopefully we'll see you guys very soon. So really what today is about is we're looking at demand management, and we're talking about electricity demand management in the wine industry. And that's of course why we're all here. Now, I put the question to you, this isn't in a full seminar, but feel free to message throughout the seminar as well, just so we've actually, I know that you guys are listening, and if you've got any particular questions that you want answered anytime throughout the seminar, please go right ahead. So I put the first question to you and just ask, do you actually know if you're on a demand-based tariff or not? Are you on a contractual system or something else? And even further back, I'd ask you, do you actually know what a demand tariff is? And hopefully throughout this entire session, these are the things that we'll be talking about and going over. So the first thing that I really want to do is give a bit of background and talk about electricity supply and demand in this across South Australia and across Australia as a whole. Now, the reason I want to do that is so you guys have got a little bit of understanding about why we're in the situation we're in, what's been happening from a national grid perspective, and that should at least give you a little bit more appreciation about what's going on and why, and so that when we talk about things like tariff rules, you can understand why they've been put in effect. So of course, naturally, we'll be talking about the demand tariff rules. The reason for that is fairly simple. The best way to manage your demand is to really understand how and when you're being charged. So if you can take advantage of that and implement some no-cost or low-cost solutions, which are usually the best, to implement some fairly basic demand management systems, then these are the projects that you have as an outcome, and this is what you can do to actually decrease your demand and manage your demand through the system. So that's a little bit of what we're going to be going through today. So a lot of it's going to be the Luke, who's my co-speaker today from 2XE. We'll be talking about the low cost, no cost solutions, and then some more advanced systems as we go through. So we'll just get started here. So supply and demand. So this is a fairly big issue that we're going to talk about. This is what's causing a lot of these demand response issues. So let's go over that fairly quickly. Now, there's a couple of ideas that we want to get across here. The first thing is, whenever you flick on a light switch in your home, you expect to be getting light coming through. Whenever you plug something in to a power point, again, you're expecting the equipment to turn on. Now, you're creating your own little micro area of demand within your own house. But that demand has to be supplied by somewhere. Now, considering how many people are in Australia, or South Australia even, and how many different behaviours are responsible for creating that demand, the supply and demand framework is continually changing. So really, supply and demand and electricity distribution is in a constant state of flux. So it's never the same. It changes from second to second, from minute to minute, every hour of the day. So whenever we create this demand through our individual behaviours, we end up with a significant variation of demand throughout the day. We've also got high levels of renewable energy that's being generated in SA as well. So because of that, we have our demand, we have our supply, and then we have the surplus, which could be, which needs to be fired from either our gas plant or by importing from Victoria or in the eastern states. So when you look at that, what I'm going to do is just show you the next graph. Now, this that you've got on the screen now, this is something from called NemWatch. So NemWatch is the National Energy Meter, real-time energy use. Now, I've actually got this live in another sheet, which I'll show you a little bit later. But down the left-hand side here, and hopefully, yep, you can see that on the presentation. So down the left-hand side here, we have the different graphs, and for each one of these states, we have a different electricity generation source. So here in SA, as you can see, anyone who's watching today knows it's relatively hot today. So we've got our gas-fired boiler. On top of that, there's a very small amount of wind that we're getting generated through this as well. We've got our large solar systems that, considering it's a nice bright day outside, but they're not generating a lot of electricity at the moment. And then we've got our small residential areas. So this bar up the top here in its totality is all the electricity that's being generated in South Australia at the moment. Now below this is our demand. So as you can see, our demand for electricity is actually slightly greater than what our generation is. So what that's going to mean is that here over in this graph here, we'll be importing electricity from Victoria. And I've actually realized I've just made a small mistake. This is actually from several days ago, this graph, so this isn't the live graph. But at the time it was a cool day and it was a cloudy day, hence why it was demand and generation electricity usage are a little bit lower. So I want to go over to the next graph here. So this is 4 days later, and I've just highlighted, so this is still probably in the last month. 4 days later, this is a hot day, so we had much bigger demand, much bigger electricity generation as well, because it was a windy day. So we're ending up with a lot of electricity being generated from a wind farm, and we're also looking at a large solar. I think it was still a little bit cloudy because solar's not that high, but demand was lower than what our generation was. So that means that we're exporting a little bit of electricity to Victoria. And if you have a look at this line here, Victoria had a much greater demand than what they were generating. So we go on to the next graph here, which is just 1 hour later. So things have obviously changed. Demand's higher again. So this is actually later in the day. So people are actually coming home and starting to switch on air conditioners, etc. The wind's died down just a little bit. Sun's still up, but what we can see here is the gas turbine that we've got here in SA has increased a lot more, but still not enough to fix demand. So we're importing electricity. Now this wouldn't be from Victoria. This would now be from New South Wales, or from a split size from Tassie potentially. And then this was the same day at night, and as you can see, we no longer have any solar. It's still relatively warm, but our supply and demand is relatively the same. So the wind's picked up a little bit, the gas turbine's going quite well, and our demand is pretty much equal with our generation. Now, this is an interesting one because this was the day after the storms a couple of weeks ago. So it was a much cooler day. It was sunny, but it was still very, very windy. So what we can see here is all of the electricity that we're using in South Australia was being generated from wind power. Now, of course, the gas turbines are still on because we can't actually have them ever switched off fully. And we've still got solar. So we're quite happily exporting all of our electricity across to Victoria. So the main message that I want to get across at this point is that our electricity, both supply and demand, is constantly changing throughout the day. What I'm going to do is just skip to a live copy of this NEM website, which is here. So this is Thursday the 6th of December at 10:20 a.m. So if we have a look outside here in SA, it is relatively hot, but the sun's shining quite nicely. So we've got solar panels that are starting to kick on, wind turbines kicking on, but the gas turbine's still in continual use. So when we have a look down through this section here, we can see that our demand's still slightly higher than what is being generated. But look, if you do go to, you can see the link up the top here. So this is NemWatch or Rural Economy. You'll be able to get this widget, but it paints a fairly decent picture. And you can see New South Wales is largely being driven by black coal. Same with Queensland. Victoria's been driven by brown coal, and etc. So, South Australia's energy requirements are actually quite mild and quite meek compared with a lot of the other states. So we'll just go back to the presentation now. There we go. So, because our supply and demand changes at every minute, you can imagine that when we're generating electricity, the actual cost of generating that electricity also varies quite significantly. So usually if there's a low demand period, electricity is going to be very cheap. When there's a high demand period, electricity gets more expensive. Naturally, the electricity generators or suppliers, they'll use the most efficient system possible, and then as demand increases further and further, less efficient systems will have to be switched online to meet demand. So in the real market, electricity can vary significantly, anything between 1 cent per kilowatt hour to $1 per kilowatt hour and greater. And I actually just had a look at the supply and demand curve this morning. So this is the supply and demand curve. So this tells you the spot price of electricity. And this one's actually in New South Wales, but you can see it's hovering around the 10 cent per kilowatt hour mark here. And then they're expecting, this is an anticipated increase of electricity, which is matching demand. So just mute it. There we go. Cool. Now this is South Australia today. So for the most part, our electricity, the cost of electricity was hovering around the 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour until right about here, where it's expected, and this is anticipated in a future area. It's had a little bit of feedback, but we'll get that sorted. So we've got the future area here, where we're looking at a price of around $12 a kilowatt hour. So we've gone from 5 cents down here to $12 a kilowatt hour at approximately 5 p.m. this afternoon. So this is going to be happening when people are going home and switching on their air conditioners. So this is a dynamic price. This is the price through here, and this is the demand here. So this is anticipated from this point onwards. So the people that actually do the forecasting and have to base this on what people's behaviors are going to be like, they have to be quite skilled in what's happening at any particular point in time. Now, we've talked about supply and demand as far as the supply and demand of electricity. Now what we're going to do is talk about peak demand and what that means for the network structure. So I'm going to skip to this graph here because it is fairly easy to get confused between use and demand, and they are two very different things. So for both of these graphs that we've got here, both of them are using exactly 500 kilowatt hours per day. As you can see, the orange graph that we've got here, it's all the area underneath. So on average, it's slightly lower than the blue one. And the blue one's all the way across is perfectly straight. Now, although they both use 500 kilowatt hours per day, the demand for the orange graph is roughly 10 times higher than what the demand for the blue line is. Now, what that means is this creates a huge burden on the infrastructure for the transmission networks. So we're talking about transmission lines, substations, and when that happens, you need to make sure that they have the capacity to actually fulfill the demand that we are creating as consumers. So if I skip to the next graph here. So what we're looking at here is what happens when we end up with a peak occurrence. So in a 30-minute period, you'll end up paying for the peak load that you use throughout the entire year. So this is something that will get set. Now I'll explain that a little bit later because it's a little bit confusing at the moment. But what I'd say is that the highest quantity of electricity you use in a single instant will govern what your peak demand is, providing it's within a certain time frame. Now, of course, this occurs when everyone's putting on their air conditioners, when you're running refrigeration systems. Again, it creates a huge strain on the transmission infrastructure. So 2017-2018 was the second warmest summer on record. Now, although it was the second warmest summer on record, it wasn't the greatest peak demand that we had. The reason behind that, although on average it was a lot higher, we didn't have as many heat waves as what we had in previous years. So our actual peak remained relatively low. It's when we have these long sustained heat waves that the peak demand in Australia goes through the roof. And that's when we start to cause problems. So if we have a look here, these are the demand that so electricity generators need to supply the demand that we create, and they have to get that through our transmission systems, our substations, transformers. The generators have to keep online, and then again we've got the Tesla battery. So the Tesla battery, just for people to be aware of, it's not there to store energy for the long-term use or to supply large amounts of electricity over a long period of time. What it's there really for is to stabilize the grid, so that when we have a very short peak demand, it can help meet that and respond to any deficit in electricity or electricity generation, and keep the electricity signal up and running. In years gone past, we used to just have rolling blackouts. I'm not sure if you remember in the 80s that, if the peak demand in Australia was too high, you'd have a rolling blackout and one suburb might be knocked out and another suburb might be knocked out. Now, today in 2018, that's not really acceptable. You can't say to a series of customers or the Australian industry that, you're not going to have electricity for about 3 hours. I hope you don't mind. It's just to keep the rest of the grid up. So for that reason, the infrastructure that we do have needs to be fairly robust to be able to sustain the peak demand. So the infrastructure can already handle the average demand, that's fine. But it's when it hits the peak demand, and that's what's causing the additional energy and the additional robustness of the infrastructure that we have. Not only that, the infrastructure that we've got is getting a little bit old too. So this is what we're talking about with peak demand and what that actually impacts. So this is an excellent example, and it was one of the best ones I thought of for how to describe the impact of peak demand. So EastEnders. So over in the UK, we have the UK Electricity National Grid department there who watch EastEnders during the day for their shift. The reason they do that is because they end up with a massive power spike at the end of EastEnders. And the reason behind that is quite interesting. It comes back down to behaviour, and it's a very British thing. When EastEnders finish, everyone sits down and makes a cup of tea. So we've got several million kettles getting turned on all at the same time. And when that happens, it creates a massive spike in the peak demand of electricity for the UK. So as you can imagine, that just to give you a little bit of an idea about how much that is. So there was an episode of Who Shot Phil on EastEnders, and when that finished, there was one of the greatest power spikes in the UK. So that was a 2,000 megawatt hour spike, which is more than the base load of many of our states combined. So that just in Australia, so that just tells you just how much strain it puts on the infrastructure. Now, Britain, the UK is slightly different in that they've got a little bit of additional supply they can tap into. They've got, they do have coal plants, they've got wind power, they've got still some coal systems in place, but they can also import electricity from France and Netherlands and from nuclear generation as well. So there's a lot more options for them. But the bottom line is that the EastEnders, when that ends, then basically anyone at the UK National Grid is trying to source electricity and getting ready for a big spike that's just about to come. So again, all this comes back down to behaviour. In an ideal situation, you'd probably see a message from the BBC just asking all the British citizens to please pause for making your cup of tea after EastEnders by 5 minutes, and then the other half just delay it for another 10 minutes, and that would spread the peak out a little bit. But in reality, changing behaviours like that is quite different, and it's quite hard to do. But what has actually, this doesn't actually occur anymore, like this issue with EastEnders, and the reason it doesn't occur anymore, it's got nothing to do with people with a desire to change behaviours. It's because of the advent of Netflix. So because we have real-time streaming now, there's not a glut when everyone will be watching the same program at the same time. And so the tea making at the end of an episode can happen at any stage of the day or night. So that's where we get a little bit of a difference in behaviour. In Australia, one of the most common peaks that we have comes across about 5 o'clock, between 4:30 and 5:30, 6 o'clock at night during summer, for the simple reason everyone's going home and everyone's switching on their air conditioners. So again, this creates a huge peak in energy demand for our country. So given that, so we talked about supply, and we talked about supply and demand and peak demand. Let's just go over a little bit of information here. So now we're in the area where we've started to create business tariffs. So these are demand management tariffs that we're now seeing from people like the SA Power Networks and the Infrastructure Group. So why are we actually seeing these tariffs? Well, it's to give a reflection on the true cost of operating the network. It's probably not something that we've actually had in the past. We do have an aging infrastructure which needs to be replaced. Again, we have more homes with air conditioning, reverse cycle air conditioning than ever before. And you'll notice that the peak really only starts off between 4 and 5:30. Now the air conditioners are still on after that time, but they've done the bulk of their work in that first hour. So that's why we tend to see a spike there. And that spike that we saw earlier on that supply and demand graph, that was quite significant. And that's going to be almost all in response to the hot weather we're having today. So again, the sizing infrastructure issue that we're looking at here, we're looking at sizing just for the simple reason that the infrastructure needs to be able to support our peak demand, not just the average demand, but the absolute peak of demand that we have in this area. Now, there's two things that we're looking at here as far as tariffs are concerned. Now, these two areas here, we've got tariffs are getting in place to incentivize customers and to change behaviours. So for the simple reason, it's the same as taxing or fines or anything like that. Basically, any customers that we've got who are high demand users will get penalised in the form of additional costs. Now, if you're using a relatively low peak load and it's more average and spread out throughout the day, you'll end up with a much lower electricity bill. So this is the overall objective, is to balance and flatten the load of electricity demand and electricity spikes. Okay, if you think about it, how this has happened in the past, these sort of plans have been successful. You think about the water restrictions that we had several years ago, and this wasn't a case of, well, it was a case of fine, but it was a case of notification that you're not supposed to be using water between a certain time during the day. The impact that had on South Australia when we had that drought crisis was that after that system had been finished and we could use water whenever, the water use in South Australia never approached what it had before those rules were put into effect, even though the rules had ended, because people actually changed behaviours. And, for a lot of times they looked at their gardens and went, okay, well, what do I actually need here? Do I need drought tolerant plants, or do I need these plants that need continual water? So a lot of people changed their behaviours, and after the structures have been changed and put in place, then naturally water use decreased. And I suspect that's what's going to happen a lot with this demand management tariff as well. And you'll find out more as we go through and look at some of the solutions and the no-cost, low-cost solutions. Now, when we get to the no-cost, low-cost solutions, there's lots and lots of things that you can do, but it's just going to vary depending on which winery you've got. So some wineries might find it very easy, other wineries less so. So we'll find out. Okay, so now we need to talk about your actual tariffs and tariff prices. So for those of you who are not on a demand-based tariff, you soon will be. So basically, between 2015 and 2017, any what was called a large business who was over 160 megawatt hours of use per annum were automatically switched over to this demand-based tariff. So that's been done and dusted for large business customers. Now we've got a second wave. So beginning in 2017, and at the moment it's estimated to end in 2020, but it might go to 2021. Any small business customers who use less than 160 megawatt hours will be moved onto a demand-based tariff system. So again, you're not paying for just your electricity use, but you're paying for the intensity that you use electricity as well. Again, you can imagine for any winery that we're looking at here, the peak of energy use just happens to be in the middle of summer, and usually around 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll show you a graph a little bit later of just a typical winery and their electricity use throughout the day during vintage. So naturally about 2 p.m. at peaks, and then tapers off during night time. So what this means for the wine industry with demand tariffs. So if you're not on a demand tariff already, you soon will be. But it is fairly easy to come up with some strategies to manage your demand. And naturally, once you actually manage the demand, you need to understand the demand rules before you can manage that. So what we're going to talk about now is just this next section, which is demand tariffs and opportunities. So this is really, once you understand the rules, you can see how to circumvent the rules and how to actually minimize your electricity demand charges. Just going to take a quick break. So if you had a look at your electricity bills now compared with before tariffs, demand-based tariffs were put in place, this is what you would have seen. So on the left-hand side here, you've got your peak costs, which are usually attributed to about 50%, and then your off-peak costs, your second lowest costs. Now that you've got a demand-based system in place, your demand is usually between 40 and 50%. Sometimes for wineries who have begun to manage their demand already, it can drop down to about 30%. But then peak and off-peak is still probably second highest. Now, you look at these graphs. Now, although these graphs both talk about different ratios, the reality is that your new costs on the right for any winery is going to be far higher than what it was on the left-hand side. So if you want to make this circle grow, that will give you a better idea about the quantity of electricity and the quantity of cost change. So there's a couple of things to learn about the demand tariff structure itself. So what we've got here is, this is going to be the exact same graph that we talked about, but one of the ways that demand is charged is between 12 p.m. In the afternoon and 9 p.m. at night. If you use high quantities of electricity and a high peak demand during this time, this is what will trigger a high demand charge. So if we have a look at this, so again, this is our low demand winery 1. This is our high demand winery 2. So he's just had a single spike here for just the 30-minute interval during this red zone here. Now, what does that mean as far as the difference in price? Well, our low demand customer is probably paying about $1,000 for the demand charges, and this guy over here is probably paying about $10,000. Now, on the left-hand side, we're talking about kVA, so it's really not unusual for wineries to have up to 500 to 1,000 kVA, and spikes to go way up there. So it's roughly about $10,000 per 100 kVA. So that's just something to keep in mind. So it just gives you a bit of an idea about the business case for trying to fix this system and trying to minimize your max demand. So going over to this next slide, the way that demand's measured, it's between, this is your maximum demand charges that you will incur. It's your maximum demand in a 30-minute period between November and March, and between 12 p.m. and 9 p.m. at night, Monday through to Friday. So you can start to see a strategy here already. If you can avoid peaking your electricity use during this time, then you end up saving yourself a significant amount of money. So it's only 30 minutes, but remember, it's that 30 minutes of demand that you've created that your electricity providers have to provide you with. So by creating that demand, you need basically network infrastructure have to supply your premise with that demand that you have requested inadvertently, but that's what you've requested. So let's just look at one very quick strategy here. So this is exactly the same energy use, but now we're looking at a peak that is around between 8 and 10 a.m. in the morning. And what does that mean? It means that they're essentially the same price. Yes, there'll be a smaller charge here of an anytime demand, but what happens in this system, just so I can make this nice and clear, is whenever you reach the maximum demand, that is the maximum demand you're paying for the next 12 months. So it's not just a case of, I'll just use it, this month's electricity bill is going to be higher. So no, what that means is that you're going to be paying those high demand charges for the next 12 months. And that's the minimum that you can pay before you can request to get your maximum demand reduced again. So going back over to this system doesn't incur a permanent 12-month high demand charge. So we're outside of the red box here, and so they're pretty much the same price, except there's a small fee that's associated with that. So that's the beginning of the rules. So again, we haven't gone into the rules in depth here because it is quite a complicated structure. So we need to make sure that we've got the basics first. So looking at this graph here, this table here, what we have are the top section, which is you have two main categories that your business will fall in. Either a small business, which uses less than 160 megawatt hours of electricity, that's use, remember that's use, not demand, or a large business, which is greater than 160 megawatt hours per annum, again in use. Now you don't have a choice over this. You're either going to be in one business category or the other business category. But what you do have a choice of is tariff types. This is the second section here. So you can either be on an agreed or an actual demand tariff type. So an agreed demand basically means whatever your peak is. So going back to that graph that table that we looked at before that said Monday through to Friday after 12 p.m. before 9 p.m. the maximum energy you use in throughout the year between November and March, that is the agreed maximum demand you'll be paying for the next 12 months. So the agreed demand lasts 12 months. Now the difference is an actual demand type tariff, which is this one here. So with an actual demand type tariff, you're not getting you're not paying for 12 months, you're paying, your demand resets on a month-by-month basis. So most people think, well, in that case, why wouldn't, I'm a winery, I use the bulk of my electricity between February, March, and maybe April. So it should stand to reason that I'd be on an actual that resets every month and not an agreed that lasts 12 months. The only problem with that is that an actual tariff, while it resets back to zero at the end of every month, your actual charges for your per kVA, your actual charges for demand intensity are actually a little bit higher than your agreed demand. And so what that means is you're not necessarily better off on an actual demand type system. It can vary quite a bit, which is really, really frustrating. So what I'm going to do now is go over some of the two tariff structures in a little bit more detail. But actually before that, I will just take a quick break. If anyone's got any questions, please just type them up while I have myself a quick drink. Okay, looks like we're all good. So, but still send something through if you've got a question, and we'll keep going. Okay, so what we've got here is now we're going to go through the two demand tariff types in a little bit more detail. So the first thing we've got is our agreed annual demand period. So as we talked about before, this is the first one we use in the example. So it's any time between November and March, between 12 and 9 p.m. at night, Monday through to Friday. Whatever your peak energy use is during that time is what you'll be paying for the next 12 months. So that's one that's set. That's something that you can't really get out of. But what you can do is change the demand peaks to outside those times. We'll talk about that in a minute. So as we talked about here, one of the things I will do is anyone who's come to this seminar today, I'll send you out a list of the current prices and the fact sheets for demand tariff. So you've got two blocks, but the main thing is just remember that it's 12 p.m. to 9 p.m. Between November and March, Monday to Friday. That's when you're getting charged for your peak. So that's that half-hour increment. So, and again, when we're talking about half-hour increments, it's important to realize that, let's say that you have your electricity has peaked at 1,000 kVA for 15 minutes. Okay, so you're thinking, remember it's an average of half an hour that this gets measured. So you've peaked for 1,000 kVA for 15 minutes. Now let's say that the next 15 minutes is down to zero. What that essentially means is that the average of that half-hour block is 500 kVA. So if you do start to peak in your demand and you can measure it and you can see it, and let's say you've got an internal alarm at your winery that says we have peaked at, let's be realistic and say 400 kVA, because then if it's 400, it could peak at 450, 600, 500, etc. You're going to be paying more money for the next 12 months. But if you then switch off a few pieces of equipment, you can drag that average demand back down again, back to within what you've already agreed for, so you don't have to pay additional charges. Okay, now this graph here, this is really interesting, and I see this time and time again. So this is a demand frequency graph. So this tells us your actual demand in kVA. And how many times this occurs. So what we can tell from this is that for this winery, on average, they use 60 kVA. That's their most common energy use. This would probably be their standby or their non, or maybe even the non-vintage period time. Actually, no, it'll just be their standby time. Now, we can see a peak here that's coming up to maybe one refrigeration system kicking in and then a second refrigeration kicking in during this time. But what's happened is that if you look down here, this is where they're using the bulk of their electricity. So it's around the 400 mark. But this just tails off. So just at 630 kVA for 30 minutes, this winery was just using 630 kVA. Now I've actually looked at this raw data. It used 630 kVA for just half an hour, and then that dropped back down to 510, and it used that for about half an hour, and then it dropped back down to 390. Okay, so it's these minute single instances that set the cost of your electricity for the next 12 months. So that's why if you can come up with systems to get rid of this tail, the difference between here and there is about $25,000 per annum. So that's nothing really to sneeze at. And it comes back down to putting some systems in place to try and avoid these max demand charges. So definitely worth thinking about. So what I've done here is illustrate the difference here between your electricity use profile. So what we can see here is this line in orange is the max demand that's achieved every month. So we can see this going up and down, up and down, up and down. Now this max demand contract is what they've agreed to. So this is about roughly about 300 kVA, so about $30,000 roughly. Now, and that's what they've been on for all this time. And then something happened in March, and they had a humongous peak. So this has basically doubled their electricity demand during this stage. So again, we're talking about an increase of about $20,000, $20,000 to $25,000 during this time, from just an exceedance of a couple of short minutes. And that's it. That's the demand that they're set at for the next 12 months. So that's why it's really important to know if you can control this peak when it happens, and make sure that you can still have the peak, just have it outside of this band of months, or the band of time between 12 p.m. and 9 p.m. So that's really what you want to try and avoid. Okay, now we talk about the actual demand tariff. So for this one, the rules are fairly similar, except the shoulder period gets charged all year round. So not just between November and March, but your peak demand still happens between November and March, but this time between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. So as you can see, and remember, these are the ones that reset every month. So the rules are slightly different. And what this looks like when we actually have a real graph is, again, a typical winery on an actual base tariff. Their peak is 0 during this time because it's outside the measurement period. And then their peak ramps up in November when they're being measured. So that's peak 1, peak 2 was exactly the same value, peak 3 increased, peak 4 increased, peak 5 slightly less. And then they're outside of that recorded value again, so that drops back down to 0. Their shoulder period, again, they're getting charged for this, so high charges there, that would be the end of the previous vintage, then low in winter, and then back high over summer again, low in winter, high in summer, or vintage and non-vintage. So what does that mean then? So when you actually plot out the full electricity bill over a full year, you end up with something looking like this. So this is one winery, and this is a comparison of their monthly bill for an agreed versus an actual tariff. So it's for any winery that goes onto an agreed type tariff system, naturally they're going to be paying a lot more electricity than what they used to during vintage. But for this particular winery, the cost for their electricity dropped. So rather than being $6,000 or between $5,000 and $6,000 per month, it's dropped down to about $2,000 per month outside of vintage. But again, you've got a big peak there. So that's one way of looking at it. But you have to run this information through a simulator to really figure out which one you're going to be better off on. And this is winery 2. So similar situation, except this time the peak that they've got is again quite high, but it drops down. It doesn't drop down as much as what it had previously. So for this particular case, the actual and agreed time is roughly being charged at the same cost. It's just that they're paying extra money for an actual demand during the peak of vintage. So which one are you better off on? The hard thing is that it's really quite challenging to figure out unless you run your electricity bills and your interval meter data through a simulator. Now, again, this is going back to the EOI. As 2XC Ware consultants, we got quite frustrated that there wasn't actually any easy tools that you could use to figure out if you were better off on an actual or agreed type system. So we built a simulator that we run all our clients through. So if you do partake in this EOI, that's something that we'll do for you, as well as a lot of these other graphs and information. But look, based on our experience, although you'd think that an actual demand tariff would be better off, we're tending to find at the moment that 90% of the wineries that we've worked with are actually better off on an agreed. So that flat value that we have going across the whole time. So yeah, about 90% of wineries are better off during that system. Okay, so, and these are just a couple of extra notes that I wanted to put in here. And again, which is better if you have an agreed or an actual tariff? It does get quite hard to work out for yourself. It's a little bit hard to get help from retailers at SAPN. Now, Mark and Sawyer do have some good relationships with SAPN, so you may be able to get them to provide some additional assistance to tell you if you're better off on an agreed demand or actual demand tariff network itself. But yeah, look, definitely run it through a simulator or talk with an energy expert. And look, this is something to keep in mind as well, is when you see your electricity bills from your retailers have absolutely nothing to do with demand. That's actually a pass-through cost that they get from SAPN. So if you look on your electricity bill, you've actually got about 4 bills you're paying there. You're paying your retailer bill, so the quantity of electricity that you used. You're paying your demand from SA Power Networks, so your demand charges and network charges and fees to actually access electricity from the grid. So that's your second bill. And then you've got your AMEO charges and environmental charges and a few other bits and pieces. So there's pretty much 4 bills that you're receiving under every electricity invoice that you get, but your retailer just rolls that into one price for you, which is good and bad. Sometimes it's hard to see what you're paying for, and unless you're really data driven, you might not necessarily capture all the information that you wanted to catch. So what we're going to do now is it's been quite fortunate. I've been given the task of going through the fairly dry material, but hopefully it gives you enough information to keep you going. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pass you on to Luke, who gets to talk about all the cool technology and the actual things that you can do to try and to actually actively manage your demand. And remember, it's the low cost, no cost solutions that we're looking at first. And what we really want to do is try and find some ways to avoid those using electricity during those peak period times. Now, there really are some simple ways, just for doing some little tweaks to your refrigeration system, changing some controls, and just rethinking the way that you're actually running your operation. So I'll pass you over to Luke, and I'll be back on this camera a little bit later.
Need to have the right data and kind of know what you're looking for. so we'll be looking at putting management strategies in place and also using technologies as well to help manage our demand. So in terms of getting the right data, there's kind of 3 ways that you can get data about your electricity use. So the first one is your electricity bills, which are kind of the highest level of electricity data, I suppose. You've then also got your interval meter data as well. So that's the data that comes from the meter, which connects your winery to the grid. And then there's also sub-metering as well. So sub-metering is kind of some new technology, which is becoming a bit more prominent, I suppose, as it's dropping in price. And sub-metering data can tell you a lot of information and provide you real-time information about what's going on in your winery in regards to power. So I guess that's the main difference between interval meter data and sub-metering data. Interval meter data is kind of historical data. You can get it anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days after it's happened. And then sub-metering data can tell you what's going on in your winery in real time. So we'll also talk about how we actually manage our demand using this data as well. So what does your electricity bill tell you? It tells you kind of 3 main things. The first one is where your problems are. So what's costing you the most and what's the size of the problem as well. So it helps you identify which component of your electricity use is kind of affecting you the most and how much it's affecting you. But one of the main things to take away from your electricity bill is that it can help you develop the business case for change. So basically, it's got the cost that you pay per kVA or per unit of demand on your electricity bill, which means you can quickly calculate how much potentially you could save per year by whether reducing your demand by 10%, 20%, how much is that going to affect your electricity bill? So this is an example of some of the data that you can get from your electricity bill. So this is a combined 12 months of data, and it's basically just 12 months of costs broken up into their different sections. So as James was talking about before, you've got your demand, you've got your peak and your off-peak rates, then all your other and fixed charges as well. And in this case, the demand accounts for 130 grand per year. So that's obviously the biggest problem for our winery, and we can see it's quite a big problem as well. But if you're looking at other strategies, you might also want to focus on shifting some of your peak energy use, because peak is obviously accounting for a lot of your electricity costs as well. So how do we kind of get that data? So this is an example of an actual of a winery on an actual demand tariff, and as you can see, the electricity bill you'd likely have an electricity bill which looks similar to this. You've got your energy charges up the top, followed by your network charges here, and then all the other renewable energy charges and other charges down the bottom. But what we want to focus on is this actual, the network charges. So you've got your network peak, which is basically, I've lost control of the mouse. That's a bit funny. That one? Yeah, that's a bit odd. That's right. No, all good. So we've got our network peak charges, which is basically just the consumption which is coming through. And then you've also got, so as James is saying, you've got your shoulder demand charges. So this value here is telling you how high your demand was during that shoulder period. So the maximum demand during that shoulder period. And as you can see, it's 137 kVA, and it's getting charged at $7.55 per kVA. So it ends up being about $1,000 a month. You've also got your off-peak demand charges. So it tells you the maximum demand you reach during an off-peak period. In kVA, and as it's an off-peak period, you're not actually getting charged for that demand. Now, one of the main things that I want to point out is this is an actual demand tariff, and so you'd expect your peak, your shoulder, and your off-peak, but we're actually outside of the annual peak period as we're in May. So, what is the peak demand that we reached? Every electricity bill actually highlights your peak demand. It'll appear in a sentence like this. So down the bottom right, you've got your highest actual metered demand period is 139 kVA. So that's basically during that peak period where costs are highest. It tells you what demand you reached. And the most important thing is that it gives you the date and the time that you actually reach this demand as well. And that's important because it can help you to identify what was going on in your winery at that time. So what is leading these spikes in demand, and that's really important for developing strategies around reducing it as well. So that's an example of an actual demand tariff, electricity bill. Now, this is an agreed demand tariff, so this is a different winery. They've got a different retailer as well, but you can see that the bill actually, it looks quite similar. First thing that I want to point out again is that you've got the same sentence as the bottom right. You've got the highest actual metered demand during this period of a 365 kVA. It gives you the date that it was recorded as well and the time as well. So that's important because we can look in our network charges, our annual block 1 demand rates. That's the agreed demand for the next 12 months. So as James was saying before, that is the demand which has been set for your winery, and you basically pay that for the next 12 months. You can see that it's set at 390 kVA and is getting charged at about $10 per kVA. So it ends up being about $4,000 per month. Now, what I want to point out is that the actual demand that they reached during that peak period is 365. So what that means is that there's 25 kVA difference between what they actually used and what they're being charged for. So there's potential for this winery, if they can prove that they're not going to exceed that demand, there's potential for them to drop that demand down by 25 kVA. So reduce this 390 there, the agreed value, down to 365, which is about a 25 kVA saving. So 25 kVA times the $10 per kVA gives you about $250 per saving per month. So that equals about $3,000 of savings per year. So that's just an example of how you can quickly find out the potential savings of your winery. So you just look at how much you're being charged per kVA and then times it basically by the percent that you think you can save. So that's your energy bills. Those so the main takeaway from that is that you can always see when you reach your maximum demand, the day and the time, and basically how much you're paying for it as well. So in terms of interval meter data now, so interval meter data is the data that you get from your smart meter basically. So the point where your winery connects to the grid, that's collecting interval meter data every 30 minutes. So as James was saying, it's the average of your energy use over that 30 minutes, and it can basically tell you how and when you use your electricity on site, across the whole site. That's important that it is a combination of what's going on across your whole winery. But this is still really good information. It can help you identify improvement projects as well. So getting your interval meter data is a critical step if you want to implement some good strategies, but it's not absolutely necessary. You can still implement strategies without it, but it kind of provides you the best bet of understanding and being able to manage your energy use. Now, one tricky thing is that it's actually quite hard to get in a useful format. You can get it from SAPN, but it often just comes in a kind of raw data format, and it's hard to analyze unless you're a pro at Excel. So there are third-party energy dashboards coming out on the market as well. So they provide a service basically to analyze that data for you and turn it into nice graphs so you can actually see what's going on. Now, how do you get your interval meter data? So your interval meter data, you can get it straight from SAPN, and they have a online portal now, which you can register your site and basically download the raw data straight from there. But as I said, it comes in a raw format, and it's not really that useful unless you hand it off to either an energy expert or a software provider who can analyze it for you. Now, you can also ask for extra data from your retailer. So if you approach them, you can basically say, I want some more information about how I'm using my energy use, and they can provide you with something which might look like this. Now, it gives you a bit more of an idea about how you're using energy use throughout the day, but it doesn't provide you enough information about your demand or the quality of your power as well, which is something we'll go into a bit later. So this, while it's good information, it's not really enough info to make any good changes. Now, the kind of data that you want to be getting is this data here. So this is the kind of data that you can get from your interval meter. It's really handy, but obviously to get it into this format, you need to have it either converted through some software or worked through by an energy expert. Now, this data is great. It can tell you when you're reaching your max demand. It can tell you information about your power factor and your trends of your electricity use and all of that business. But as I said, it's often hard to get into this format. So if you're not confused yet, good job, but totally understand if this can be pretty full on. Now, that data, what can that data give you? It basically helps you to identify when and how you're using your electricity. One of the main things is that it can help you identify when you can load shed or when you can cut back on your electricity use to reduce your peak demand and save. I guess the main way it does that is because it can help you figure out what is causing your peak in electricity demand. On top of that, it helps you it basically details what your power factor is as well. And your power factor is an important characteristic of demand, which we'll talk about later. But interval meter data is the data that we need to be able to run that simulator to tell which tariff is best for you. So if you want to analyze your tariff and figure out which is best for you, you need to get access to that interval meter data. One of the other main things is it gives you your demand frequency. So that's basically that graph that James was showing before, where it tapers off to the 630. That's a demand frequency graph. It can tell you how often you're reaching those peaks in demand. And I guess the whole idea behind this data is that it can help you identify how you can save money. Now, interval meter data is great, but it always can be thought of as historical. So basically, you only get access to it maybe 1 or 2 days after it's actually happened. So you can't actually tell what's happening real time in your winery, and that's where submetering comes in. So submetering is kind of making some ground in the market because it's become a lot cheaper now. And submetering can give you an idea of what's going on real time in your winery, and basically give you the information you need to implement really advanced strategies. So submetering, while interval meter data is basically working at this level, where it combines the energy use of the entire site, submetering can be installed on specific pieces of equipment or specific areas. So for example, you could install submetering on your chiller and the pumping equipment in your refrigeration system to get an idea of what they're doing at any time. And you could also install one on, say, your processing area and your warehouse area and figure out how those specific areas are using energy use. And this really helps you to pinpoint opportunities for improvements in energy use and demand as well. I guess the main thing is that this is real-time data. This would be streaming into either your laptop or your phone, and you can set the interval that you get the data as well. So while the data that comes from your interval meter or your smart meter, which connects to the grid, that comes in 30-minute intervals, you can set submetering to give you information from every second through to once an hour, basically, whatever you choose. So the benefits of submetering is that like I said, it gives you a detailed energy use of the different subsystems. It's easier to identify opportunities in those subsystems because you can really pinpoint what's going on. And I guess the main thing is that it's one of the first steps towards implementing any kind of automated demand management. So if you want to automate and you want to know what's going on in your winery at real time, you need to have some sort of monitoring. Now, one of the other benefits, which sits kind of on the side of demand management, is preventative maintenance. So submetering can be really useful because if you've say installed a submeter on your refrigeration system, or in particular on a compressor in your refrigeration system, you can monitor the power use of that compressor directly. So basically, that allows you to monitor how much power it's using, and if you see, say, spikes in the power that your compressor is using leading up to vintage, or it's acting funny, or there's basically any abnormalities, you can say, okay, this isn't looking right. Maybe the compressor's about to conk out. Let's get another spare one lined up, ready for vintage. So basically, it helps you to identify if something is perhaps going to go wrong in those systems, which is massive for wineries because you don't want your fridge system conking out during vintage. So if you've got a backup compressor ready to go and install when that one blows, that can be massive as well. So that's one of the other benefits of submetering. So aside from demand management, there are other opportunities to install submetering as well. So again, this is the kind of data that you would be getting from submetering, but I guess the main difference is that it is coming in live. So you'd be able to see this real time, what is going on in different sections of your winery, which can be very beneficial if you're trying to manage your demand. So now we'll move on to demand side opportunities. So as James was saying in the first half, you've got demand and supply of electricity. So demand is basically looking at how you use electricity on your site, how your equipment uses electricity. So to start off with, I'd just like to go through the typical demand of a winery during vintage. So you can see that demand kind of slowly ramps up throughout the day until it peaks generally in the middle of the afternoon. So this is what generally occurs in wineries who haven't installed kind of any kind of demand management. And as you may expect, this peak in demand at about 3 p.m. Is usually caused by your refrigeration systems, but it's actually caused by more processes, more work going on basically. So whether you've started chilling must or ferments, or there's more tank cooling going on at that time, that can cause massive loading on your refrigeration, which drives up the electricity demand of your winery and basically incurs those higher costs as well. So where is electricity used in winery? As we said, it's mostly used in refrigeration systems. So wineries, refrigeration can account for up to about 70% of your energy use, and often this is what's causing those spikes in demand. So yeah, your fridge system ramps up as more activities occur, and this can increase the cost of your electricity. So what that tells us is that refrigeration is the biggest area of opportunity. So this is where we should be focusing on implementing strategies and technologies because it's going to provide us the best results. But one of the main things to ask is what actually makes wineries different. So wineries are they're subject to high variations in seasonal use, basically. So your energy use can vary dramatically throughout the year, as we know. So during vintage, you use heaps of electricity, but throughout the rest of the year, it can be quite low. And alongside this, you've got high electricity costs as well. You've also got, one of the things that makes wineries really interesting is that you've got a lot of thermal storage available in the wine. So basically, that allows wineries to be one of the industries that can actually manage demand by changing practices in the winery and changing how you operate. So one of the first things to get across is that regardless of whether your tanks are insulated or uninsulated, whether they're inside or outside, shaded or out in the sun, the wine in those tanks takes time to warm up. So I just want to put an example of some data down here. So this is a tank from a 24 kiloliter tank, which was insulated, but it was sitting outside on a 40-degree day. Now it was partly shaded. But what you can see is the wine is set to stay within a band of 4.9 degrees and about 5.5 to 5.6 degrees. So this wine on this 40-degree day, it finished cooling down at 11 a.m. and took 10 hours to warm up 0.6 degrees. So between 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. during the hottest part of the day, the wine only increased in temperature by 0.6 degrees. Now, this is important. It's also important to note that the wine only took about 1 to 2 hours to cool down as well. But this is important because we get told a lot that our refrigeration system is running really hard 24/7 during vintage, but and there's no downtime basically. But generally, when we look at refrigeration logs, we're kind of yet to see this 24/7 running flat out. Generally, there's always some refrigeration capacity available in the early hours of the morning. So from around midnight through to 6 a.m. there's some capacity in the fridge system, which is important because that's when electricity is cheap and the fridge is actually running more efficiently as well. So the last thing I wanted to point out on this graph is that what happens if we say extend the cooling band to say anywhere between 4 degrees, so somewhere down here, and 6 degrees up there. If we allow the wine to fluctuate between those temperatures, we wouldn't need to conduct any cooling, any active cooling for maybe 1 to 2 days even. So it would happily sit without any kind of cooling for a very long period of time. And I guess that's one of the main things that we can use to our advantage when we're trying to manage electricity demand in wineries. So what can you do? You can make a conscious decision about how and when you are cooling your wine. So there are a number of opportunities to choose from, but obviously we want to take a balanced approach as well, because the quality of the wine's the most important parameter, and we want to make sure that stays a high quality. So when we're looking at kind of managing our demand, there's 3 main terms that we can use. The first one is peak clipping, which we also call load shedding as well. So basically, when you're, so if we're coming from left to right here, when you're when you're getting close to a peak in electricity demand, you get here and you just start shutting stuff off and cutting back on your electricity use, so it doesn't peak and you don't incur those high electricity demand costs. The other two techniques are load shifting. So basically, if you know that you're going to be using a lot of electricity in that afternoon period, we want to shift some of the equipment use from that time to other times. So we want to shift some of that refrigeration basically from that peak afternoon time to an off-peak time. And that's very similar to valley filling as well, which is basically just aiming to flatten out that demand curve as much as possible. So how do we do this? We can so basically, if we're looking at load shifting, we can complete the bulk of our refrigeration outside of the peak period, so basically at night. As well as that, we can refrigerate the tank farm in zones, and that helps us to reduce peak refrigeration loading. And one of the main things is that we just try our hardest not to cool the tank farm while we're chilling must or ferments as well. So when we're looking at cooling in an off-peak period or shifting that refrigeration load, we can think about it as night cooling. And the Australian Wine Research Institute put some really good work into developing a case study for night cooling. So I'll just talk through this graph. So on the right-hand side, you've got a kind of business as usual refrigeration technique. So you've got a single set point temperature for the wine, and the wine's allowed to fluctuate up and down up to about 0.4 degrees above and 0.2 degrees below this set point temperature. And when the wine warms up to its upper boundary, it kind of cools down, warms back up, cools down, and there's no real structure to this cooling at all. It just happens whenever necessary. So it's happening in peak periods, basically, generally in the middle of the afternoon as the wine warms quicker. So what the Australian Wine Research Institute did was use a dual set point method. So on this left-hand side, they've changed it up a bit. So instead of using a 12 degree temperature set point for the wine, at 1 a.m. in the morning, they bring the temperature set point down by 0.5 degrees. And what this does is it forces the refrigeration system to kick in basically and cool the wine down to that 11.5. It gives a couple of hours to do this. After 2 hours, the set point temperature of the wine then jumps back up by a degree to 12.5. And it remains like that for the rest of the day. And what this allows is it basically extends the temperature band of the wine by up to a degree. And it allows the wine to basically warm throughout the entire day in that 1 degree temperature band. And then when it hits 1 a.m. again, the temperature drops back down, forces the refrigeration system to kick on. So you're cooling in off-peak when electricity is cheaper and when the fridge system is working more efficiently as well. So this technique was really effective at shifting refrigeration into the off-peak periods. And you can see that the wine still only fluctuates in a temperature band of 1 degree. So you don't really have to worry about the quality of the wine. And this set point temperature here is still set. So if it rises too far above it, refrigeration system will kick back in anyway. So this technique was really effective, and you didn't really have to worry about the quality of the wine either, because it's being managed automatically by this system. So that's an automatic system. You can also do it manually as well. You can just start turning your fridge system on in the late hours of the evening. Basically, any time past that 9 p.m. is going to be good. So you can try and conduct most of your refrigeration. Then you don't need to have an automatic system, but it obviously does make it a little bit easier. So, as well as cooling wine at night, you can also, it's also a good idea to cool the tank farm in zones as well. So as you can see here, this is an example of what you might do. So basically you set some tanks off in zone 1 and you cool those tanks from say 10 p.m. through to midnight. Zone 2, you might cool from midnight through to 2 a.m. Zone 3 from 2 a.m. through to 4. Zone 4 from 4 a.m. through to 6 a.m. And basically what this does is this spreads the load on your refrigeration system out through the entire evening. Now, if you're doing this during off-peak times, it's not going to affect your demand costs dramatically because you wouldn't be paying off-peak demand anyway. But this actually allows the fridge system to run more efficiently. And if you're not doing night cooling, this can be really effective for evening out that refrigeration load throughout the day. So that's something we really recommend. Now, in terms of actually looking at an example, so St. Hallett's, this is an example from back in 2011 actually. So this technology and this idea has been around for a while. St. Hallett's were processing 3,000 tons of grapes at the time, and started using a load scheduling model. So basically they have an automatic refrigeration control system. They were using BIMWizard. They installed a software module which basically shifted that refrigeration to an off-peak period. And before they did this, they had peak demands in the afternoon of 500 kVA. So that's incurring really massive electricity demand costs. But once they implemented this night cooling, they were able to actually reduce their peak demand by 50%. So they reduced their peak demand by 250 kVA, which is around $25,000 to $30,000 in savings per annum. So massive savings to be made, and that's simply by shifting refrigeration use. And not only demand savings were made, they actually also resulted in energy savings because the fridge system was running in off-peak, and because the fridge plant was running more efficiently as well, they actually had energy savings in the range of 25 to 35% as well. So heaps of opportunity to shift your refrigeration to nighttime. Now, again, this was an example of using an automated system, but you can do it manually as well. You really just want to focus on refrigerating outside of that peak time. And that also allows your refrigeration system to have more capacity for must chilling and for chilling ferments as well. So it's a win-win really. If you need to be using your fridge system in the afternoon, it allows it to act more efficiently for chilling must and ferments, and it can be really beneficial to your energy bill as well. So that's kind of your demand scheduling and load shifting. Sorry. Now we'll look at demand shedding. So this is basically if we just go back a bit. So basically, if we're looking at this graph here, this is your peak in demand. Say you've set your agreed demand for the year is 350 kVA, and if you exceed that, you have to pay more, and it bounces up to that for the next 12 months. So what you would do is when you get here, demand shedding is basically when you get here, you get notified by either your submeter or some form of software, or you're just keeping a keen eye on what's going on in the demand in your winery. And when you get there, you basically start turning off equipment and making sure you not turning anything else back on, basically, so you don't exceed your agreed demand. This can be really effective as well. But two ways that you can do this. Again, we're looking at refrigeration because it's the biggest energy user. So when you're nearing that peak in demand, you can turn off your low priority tanks, which will cut your refrigeration loading, and you can also increase the brine set point temperature of your fridge system. And basically what that does is that cuts the chiller out, which gives you heaps of capacity left to play with, so you can make sure you can do all the other processing that you need in your winery. And I guess there's two ways that you can do this. It can either be manual or automatic. So in both cases, whether you're doing it manually or whether you're doing it automatically, you need to know what's going on in your winery at any time. So what you need to be doing is basically monitoring that demand. So that would have to be a submeter. So you'd have to have some form of submetering installed in the demand, in the winery, monitoring your demand. And what what that does is allows you to see when you're about to exceed your peak and get charged more, and your monitoring system might automatically alert you, whether it's a notification on your laptop or an email or SMS even, when you're about to exceed that demand, and you can basically cut your energy use so you're not charged anymore. So if you're doing it manually, this would look like getting a notification and then basically having someone run around and turn off low priority tanks and increase the brine temperature set point, which is a low cost solution, but obviously because of the human error element, you're not guaranteed to actually reduce your demand and save on those costs. But if you set up an automatic system on your tank farm, it can be connected to your monitor, so you're monitoring your demand, and when you're, say, within 10 or 20% of hitting those peak demand and incurring more charges, you can automatically turn off low priority tanks and increase the brine temperature set point to cut back and basically save that money. Now, that's obviously, setting it up automatically is a higher cost solution, but you're more likely to reduce your peak in demand if you've got it correctly configured. So that's kind of your demand side opportunities. Now we want to look at supply side opportunities. So supply is obviously the electricity which is coming in from the grid or coming in from, say, a solar system or a generator. And the first thing we wanted to talk about was power factor. So power factor is a bit of a funny concept. Now, on your electricity bill, you're getting charged for electricity in kVA. So you're getting charged for electricity demand in kVA. So kVA is actually a combined value of the kilowatts, which, so as you probably know, your motors and all your equipment uses kilowatts of power. But heavy motors or heavy duty motors with magnetic fields, they actually affect the quality of the power which comes in and create some form of wastage, which is known as kVAR. Now, the easiest way to think about this is in a beer. So basically what you're using is your kilowatts, and that's what you get to drink. But there's some amount which is lost to the head of the beer as well, but you pay for the entire beer, you pay for the entire kVA. And basically, so power factor is about the quality of the power. So you want a power factor of 1, and that means your kilowatts and your kVA are basically identical. So you're not wasting any demand. So you want a power factor of 1, but often wineries who have a lot of machinery, the power factor can drop quite substantially. So if you do have a power factor issue, what can you do about it? You can install power factor correction. So power factor correction is basically a bank of capacitors which corrects the quality of your power and allows you to stop wasting that demand, because it brings it. Basically, what power factor correction does is it brings removes this entire kVAR and brings the kVA down to this kilowatt value, so it's closer to, you've got a power factor close to 1 and you're not wasting any demand. So here's an example of a winery that we worked with. At the top of the graph, you've got kind of the start of vintage, and at the bottom of the graph, you've got the end of vintage. So kind of days are going downwards and the time of day is going from left to right. Now, what this is just a heat map of power factor. So basically where it's red, it means the power factor was below 0.8, which means, you've got a poor quality of power and you're paying more for your demand. Now, so at the start of vintage, this winery had a poor power factor. They had an average power factor of about 0.7, which is really quite poor. And this meant that they had a maximum demand of 540. So now if we go back to this graph, that means that 0.7 of their kVA was being used in kilowatts, while 30% was being wasted on the head, on the kVA or the head of the beer, basically. And so what you can do in that instance is install power factor correction. Now that reduces the head of the beer and basically brings the power factor up to about 0.98. So that's why it's turned to green now. So green means it's above 0.95. And that's a good value for your power factor. And what that basically means is that you stop wasting 30% of that demand. So your new maximum demand in kVA is now 378. So this winery made a saving of 162 kVA, which was approximately $20,000 saving per annum. So by installing power factor correction, this winery made a saving of $20,000 per annum. Now, couple of important things to note is that the unit itself, it cost around $20,000 to install, so had a payback period of about a year. So it's quite a good investment, or a very, very good investment actually. But it's important to note that this isn't always applicable to every winery because power factor varies. So I can recommend though, if you haven't heard about power factor or if you haven't done an analysis before, really recommend assessing your power factor. Now you can get information about your power factor from your interval meter data, and you can talk to SAPN about it, but they're not always that helpful. So it's best to get in touch with an energy expert to find out more about your power factor. So there are big savings to be made, but there's a few other technologies that we wanted to talk about as well. So obviously, these next few technologies aren't directly relevant to demand management projects, but we obviously get asked about them a lot, so we wanted to go through them quickly. Now, solar PV, it's a good investment if you use energy all year round, so sometimes it's not in a winery, but generally the payback on a solar system can be quite good. But solar generally aims at improving your on-site energy consumption. You can't really count on solar being used as a demand management strategy because you don't know the sun's going to be shining. So we can't say, okay, when we're reaching our peak in demand in the afternoon, our solar system is going to drop that by say 30 kilowatts if it's a 30 kilowatt solar system, because you simply don't know that it's going to be producing that much power. So while solar can be a good investment, it's not really applicable for demand management. One of the other technologies that we want to talk about was diesel generators. So diesel generators can be used for demand shedding. So like I said, instead of, so when you're nearing that peak in demand in the afternoon, instead of running around and turning things off or having it automatically turned off, you could instead flick a diesel generator on. Basically what that would do is that would reduce your demand from the grid, and you could cut that peak in demand. So there's potential to do that with some generators, but a lot actually can't. So a lot of generators in wineries in particular are kind of set up for backup power. They're not to be set up to be used as prime power systems or in parallel with the grid. So unless a generator has been specifically installed, knowing that it could be used for demand shedding, it's unlikely that you can actually use it in this case. So if you are looking to get a generator installed, it's worth investigating whether you could set it up to do demand shedding as well. So one of the other things to keep in mind is that the cost to run a generator is actually quite high. So at the moment, diesel was about $160 when I put this slide deck together. So it was costing about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. So that obviously varies with the cost of diesel, but when you're comparing it to grid electricity, which is on average around 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour, it is a bit more expensive. So it's only really useful to use if you are effectively managing your demand, but a lot of them aren't set up to do that. So just wanted to mention that, and I guess that kind of leads into this newer area of technologies, which is battery storage. So batteries can be used in a very similar way to generators. They can be used to shed your peak demand when you're nearing those peaks in the afternoon. Batteries can also be used to store any kind of excess solar that you're generating. They can be used as well to charge. They can be charged up in the morning and during off-peak times when electricity is cheap, and then discharged in peak times when electricity is more expensive. But what we've seen at the moment is that they're still expensive and prices are too high for them to provide a decent financial return. So we're not recommending battery storage at this stage. But this graph down the bottom right, it shows the price of batteries from 2013 through to 2016. You can see in 2013 they were about $600 per kilowatt hour, and over those 4 years it dropped to about $273 per kilowatt hour. So more than half the price over those 4 years, and it's dropped further to 2018, and they're actually expecting it to drop another 40% over the next 2 years. So while batteries aren't applicable quite yet, there's definitely some potential to look back into them in a few years or so. So batteries can be used, but we're not really using them yet. And one of the reasons for that is because the technology is not quite there in terms of the smart energy management. So battery technology it's nearing there, and if you have a really advanced system, you can use it to effectively reduce your demand. But a lot of the time, the systems aren't actually capable of doing that as well. So you want to be really careful when you're investigating batteries. So that kind of does it for the supply side opportunities. So just to go back over them quickly, power factor correction is a massive opportunity. If you haven't heard about it, definitely recommend analyzing your power factor at your site. But solar generators and batteries are all kind of used for solar is used for more aiming to reduce your energy consumption rather than your demand, and generators and batteries are quite an expensive option to conduct demand shedding. So it's better to just focus on management strategies around your refrigeration system first. Now it kind of moves us into what's on the horizon for demand management, and you may have heard about demand response. So when James was saying earlier, the grid is basically always in this state of flux between energy demand and electricity demand, electricity supply, and as we see these peaks in electricity demand during a heat wave in the afternoon, you basically have all these generators or electricity generators which have to ramp up and provide all of this electricity, and it costs a lot basically. And what a few businesses are looking into, and actually the Australian Renewable Energy Agency is looking into, is demand response instead. And basically what that is when we're hitting those peaks in the summer afternoons, instead of supplying more energy to the grid, how about we cut our demand? And what they're basically doing is they're working with large businesses to basically have a sacrificial demand, which so basically just demand response, so shutting big pieces of equipment down during those peak times, and there's a financial incentive provided for that as well. So in SA we've got Energy Australia, who's a retailer. They're working a bit in demand response. There's Intercast and Forge as well, who are one of the big metal smelters. I think they do a lot of metal work, and they've obviously got lots of sacrificial load. So the distributors have been paying them to reduce their load on the grid. And Zen Ecosystems is actually an interesting one. They're looking at kind of smaller retail, household and small business demand response. And basically how they're doing it is they're installing remote controlled thermostats and air conditioners in these households. And what that allows them to do is that when these demand response incidents occur, so the grid's getting very heavily strained and they want to cut back on demand, all of these remote controlled thermostats and air conditioners bump up by 1 degree, which just cuts their electricity use by a little bit. But basically when you combine thousands of households together, that creates a sizable difference to the demand on the grid. So that's one of the technologies which is being used. Now, Flow Power, you can see in New South Wales, Flow Power has been listed here. Now, Flow Power is one of the Sawyer partners, yeah. So one of the partners of Sawyer, and they're doing a lot of work with wineries as well, actually, to implement this kind of demand response. So one of the things that they're doing is they're working with wineries to get them onto the wholesale market. So that graph that James showed earlier about the fluctuating price in electricity, which peaks up to about $12 per kilowatt hour, these wineries would be paying those prices directly, and it can actually be quite good for wineries to get on a wholesale market as well, if they can effectively manage their demand. But in SA, there's the RERT scheme, which is a demand response initiative, basically. So there's a few wineries which are actually involved in that as well already. So those wineries have at least 200 kilowatts worth of demand that they can cut back, which is kind of a general refrigeration system. So those wineries can cut back on their electricity demand during those peak times, and they basically get paid to do it as well. So I think they're getting paid $5,000 to reduce their demand at that time. And remember, these demand response episodes, they only last basically 1 to 2 hours as well. So a very short amount of time that you need to cut your electricity demand, but you can be paid a decent amount for it as well. So kind of in summary, what would demand response look like? So this is something that you should be interested in as a winery moving forward if you're a bit of a bigger one, but also it's becoming more applicable for smaller wineries as well, is that You can work with your retailers to schedule loads. So if so it's the morning of a very hot day and you can see that electricity demand is going to peak, these retailers might get in touch with you to say, do all of your refrigeration now so that we don't have any loading in the afternoon, and we'll pay you some amount for it. The other option is using smart battery storage or your existing assets such as generators to kind of add power back to the grid during times of need. So for 1 to 2 hours, you might get your battery to provide power or your generators to provide power to the grid, and you'll be paid for that essentially. The last one was about that Zen Ecosystems one, where they're installing monitoring and remote control capabilities to air conditioners around houses. But there's also potential to install this kind of technology in wineries as well, say to remotely increase the brine set point temperature by maybe only 0.5 degrees, which would cut the chiller in your fridge system out and provide that reduction in demand. And again, you would be paid for it. So that's kind of what demand response is. It's something worth keeping an eye out for as you move forward. So Flow Power, who is a partner of Sawyer, is actually working this field as well. So if you are interested in demand response, you can get in touch with them and see what you can do. Now, that's kind of it. That's it for the webinar, I suppose. But I'll pass back over to James, who's going to quickly summarize what we've gone through today and kind of a few key takeaway points as well, I guess. So I think we'll just mute me and we'll swap back over quickly, and James can go from there.
Get that focus, that's going to be the question. Yeah, maybe not really. Wait, am I unmuted? Okay, guys, we got quite excited because I've just seen Mark Gishens just showed me a particularly interesting app which looks at electricity and how it's actually flowing through from Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland to South Australia. And it's actually got it real time, but we can't quite get it working at the moment, but it's just absolutely amazing. What we're actually ending up with is that massive peak in demand that we're going to be getting this afternoon. I'm actually going to be watching this because I want to see what happens and where we actually get our electricity from across the grid. So it could be quite interesting. Anyway, look, there's probably a few things to get through with today and what we really want to communicate. What's really important is do what you can first to try and avoid getting the situation where you've got high demand. So if you can shed your refrigeration loading, just do the bulk of your refrigeration loading. Outside of those times, it means that you have so much more demand that is free to use critical systems such as chillers for must crush, fermentation tanks, your crushers yourself. I mean, this is where the real opportunity lies in it. Look, definitely check your tariff and figure out if you're on a grid or actual and which one's better. Monitoring, well, that's a huge thing right now is monitoring, and one of the things we're doing at 2XE is just trying to find out if we can strike up a bit of a deal or a bargain to try and get some inexpensive monitoring systems in place so that wineries can A, see what their demand's like on a real-time basis, and B, get alerts when they're approaching their agreed max demand. So basically that means that you'll get SMS alerts or email alerts, whatever actually allows you to perform action to make a change, so to actually a physical start. Look, have a look at power factor, but again, once you've looked at load shedding as much as your refrigeration use or load shifting your refrigeration use, then yeah, look at load shedding. So try and avoid the situation where you've got a high peak during that middle of the day. And then if that works, then just look at other factors that you can put in place. And look, absolutely, potential of battery technology and demand response moving forwards. There's a lot that's going on, but just watch this space for now and don't go investing yet in batteries unless you've done all your homework to go with them. Look, so again, just talking about the next steps with the expression of interest. So anyone who wants to use the Giza and Sawyer service to engage us to come on site and basically do a practical assessment of your winery, have a look at things that are practical and easy to do, so your low cost, no cost items, followed by your more advanced systems. Come and engage us. So we're going to try and find out where the opportunities are for your winery. We'll end up doing an analysis for your electricity bills, figure out what tariffs are right for you, and look at sub-metering. And for the most important part is looking at business case. Now, just be aware that there are limited spaces for this EOI, and what we really want to do is we want to have a case study that we can share with the wine industry. So I believe it's actually fairly competitive at the moment, but please put in an application, and if hopefully we can get everyone through on this system. But if you don't get through on this system, then we'll always have there's always the Giza REAP program where we can do very similar work. That's probably about it for me. But look, there's lots you can do, and it doesn't need to be doom or gloom. But if you stay ahead of the game, you can really manage those network demand prices and end up with in a much better situation for the long-term sustainability of your winery. Mark, got anything else that's...
Look, I'll stay off camera. James is much more handsome than me. I just want to thank you all for coming. Just a couple of reminders again. Sawyer has 2 industry partners that provide discounts for Sawyer members. So if you're a member, you can access those, and that's P4B that provide solar, but they also provide power factor correction equipment. So give us a call if you're interested in that, and also Flow Power, who offer a special discount for wholesale energy. You've got to be in the large market for that. In other words, over 160 megawatt hours per year. But they certainly offer Sawyer members a better rate than you would normally get. So any questions about that, just give me a call directly. That's fine at the office. With the second part is the expression of interest. Please send those in. Try and fill in those forms and just get them back to me. We will be looking at them fairly promptly, so do it now. Get it off your desk and out of the in-tray, and get them back to us. Thirdly, I just would like to thank once again ASBO for providing the webinar conferencing and webcasting facility, in particular Chris Waters, who's been our technician behind the scenes. We're really grateful for their assistance in staging this event. And to James and Luke, thank you both very much for presenting the seminar. The webinar will be recording will be available, and we'll be loading it up to our website soon. Anything more?
Yeah, we'll be sending out just to keep you guys up to date. We'll also send you out an email with some of the things like the tariff structures and just some of the key concepts and some of the hyperlinks to NemWatch and AEMO and this new app that we've just found as of a minute ago, which looks amazing. But all that sort of information. So stay tuned, and we'll send that out to you soon.
Thank you very much. Let's close.